So I am here with Rutgers professor Julien Musolino to talk about his upcoming book, The Soul Fallacy. And I'll let him take the floor and tell us a little bit about that and yourself.
Oh, thanks for having me, Leo. So I'm a cognitive scientist here at Rutgers University. I have a dual appointment in the psychology department and in the Center for Cognitive Science. I came from France originally. I came to the U.S. in the mid-90s, 1994, to attend grad school, and I've never left since. I'm still here. Professionally, I'm interested in sort of two sets of questions from a general public's perspective. One is narrower and has to do with my area of expertise in developmental psycholinguistics, which is the study of how children acquire language. But I'm also interested in a broader set of questions that have to do with the implications of science, the sciences of the mind, science generally, for questions that really matter to the general public, like, for example, the question of whether people have souls or not. And so this is what got me to write my first popular science book, The Soul Fallacy.
That's right, and I hear someone very interesting is giving the foreword to the book, or the...
Yes, indeed. So I'm very glad that the physicist and best-selling author Victor Stenger, with whom I've corresponded, has kindly agreed to write and already wrote. I saw the piece, the foreword to the book.
Well, congratulations on that. That's awesome.
It's a nice endorsement. Yes, absolutely.
So, okay, now on that, just how did you get interested in science in the first place? What was it like growing up in France? Or
So there's one story I remember in particular that I think maybe triggered my interest. Maybe not, but I kind of like the story, so I'll share it with you. So I was probably about 10 or 11, growing up in France, as you said. And one day on TV, they were broadcasting live from Cape Canaveral, from Florida, the launch of a spacecraft. And I was in awe of this. It's amazing. Space, association with science, flying to the moon and everything. And the program wasn't dubbed. And so you had the real American voices. That too I thought was really awesome. So I associated science, space, English, and so I thought at the time in my mind as a 10-year-old that if I want to be successful, I have to do two things. I have to, one, sort of get into the sciences, and two, I have to learn English.
Smart 10-year-old.
So I don't know if that's what really led me to what I did, becoming an academic, moving to the U.S., but I kind of like the story.
Yeah, no, it's a good story. All right, so now let's move on to, I guess, the bulk of our conversation, which is your book. So could you maybe tell us, boil it down to a few main points, if you can?
Sure. I think the first thing we should do to set the stage is think about the kind of soul that this book is about. It's very important, and everything sort of flows from there. The soul that the soul fallacy is about is the traditional soul. It happens to be the soul that most people in the U.S. believe in. And this soul has three properties. The first property, the first claim that people make about the soul is that it is non-physical or immaterial. I'm sure you've heard this before. The second property is that the soul, or at least the modern soul, we could go over the history if you'd like later of the soul, or of the souls as it turns out. But the modern soul, the soul that people believe in, has the second property of being what I call psychologically potent. So it contributes to our psychological functioning. People will tell you that it gives them a moral compass, so the ability to tell right from wrong, free will, consciousness, the ability to have feelings past their personality even. And the third and very important property is that it's claimed or believed to be immortal, so that when your body dies, the souls, which really is your consciousness, so carries your consciousness into the afterlife, where you can be happy or unhappy, recognize grandma in heaven, for example. So that's the soul that the book is about. And it turns out, we know from lots of polls going back decades actually, and some of the studies I've done here at Rutgers, that this is what most people happen to believe in. Even it turns out students, I got interested a few years ago in whether students who take upper level undergraduate classes in psychology, like the ones I teach, for example, cognition, and who are told repeatedly about what we call the physical basis of mind, I thought, well, surely this could have an impact on one's soul beliefs.
Right.
And so I thought, I'm going to ask them. And much to my surprise, I found that the overwhelming majority of undergraduates here at Rutgers, and it turns out to be true of other places too, there are studies about the Ivy League where it's more or less the same, believe in the soul, which is exactly like the one that I discussed, I mentioned earlier. It's very close to the kind of soul that Descartes had in mind. There are minor differences, but very close actually.
So on that note then, would that make science and soul beliefs mutually incompatible, or somehow the soul can go into a scientific domain of knowledge? You got something to say about that?
Yeah, so one of the main claims in the book is that once we understand the soul to be what we just said, and once we realize that's what most people believe in, the second step is to show, which is not very hard, that this notion of soul is in fact, or represents a scientific claim or a series of scientific claims. And there are sort of two ways to show this. The first has to do with this notion of detachability. So the idea that when you die, the body ceases to function, but the soul, so the mind or aspects of the mind continue to function, like consciousness and everything. This makes a testable prediction, actually. And Bertrand Russell, the great Bertrand Russell, who we talked about earlier, already pointed this out in 1935, I believe, when he wrote Science and Religion, his essay on science and religion. He mentioned the fact that he had a little section on the soul, and he said that there could be evidence, he said, that could convince reasonable men that there's such a thing. So the way to think about this is, suppose, for example, that it were possible to, say, talk to the dead. I don't mean the type of thing you see on TV, which is not really serious, but suppose you could establish communication through rigorous controlled experimentation, knowing full well that someone is dead, so you can have their ashes in an urn, so you know the body's not functioning anymore, and then you can make contact with them. Well, if so, then, and experimentally it would not be hard to do. In fact, there's a prize that's being offered by
James Randi.
James Randi, yes, $1 million for anybody who could show this under serious controlled conditions. So if the world worked that way, if we could get evidence in that direction, then yeah, it would tend to support the claim that consciousness and the mind can operate without the body. So that makes it perfectly scientific. Another way to look at this from a slightly different angle is involves the phenomenon of near-death experiences. So where people report having very unusual subjective experiences that they associate with imminent death. And one of these phenomena is the so-called out-of-body experience, where people report subjectively viewing themselves as though they were outside their body. So it's like the camera is our consciousness now, and we're looking at ourselves from a third-person perspective. And you can see our own body on the bed in the room and supposedly hear everything that's going on. Well, that too leads to a testable prediction, which has been tested, and it's failed to uncover anything serious, of course. But the idea is you can put laptop computer sets, say, on top of a closet, where you know that the person lying in bed could not possibly see anything. Okay, so the physical body can't see anything. But a soul floating about the room could easily see the display on the computer. So if, upon regaining consciousness, the person were able to recite perfectly what they saw on the monitor, then you would have evidence that you can somehow perceive and see and remember with something other than your body. So that would be evidence. Of course, there's no such evidence. People claim there is, but the studies are terribly done, and serious people who publish in this just tell you it doesn't work, basically. So that's one side of the question that shows that the soul hypothesis is a scientific one. The other side has to do with the claim that the soul is non-physical or immaterial. The claim is that somehow it's immaterial or non-physical, but it can causally interact with the body. Descartes famously had this notion. Descartes specified where in the brain he thought that the soul interacted with the body. It's a small structure called the pineal gland. So he thought that the soul, the immaterial soul, somehow interacts with the body there and makes us do what we do. But
why did he think that? Was there any?
Because I think because there's only one such structure, it's not symmetrical, and so I think he thought that was the place. I don't think there was anything deeper.
Oh, okay. So just, pretty much arbitrary then.
Yeah, I think so. So what led to the demise, according to historians and philosophers, of substance dualism, this idea that mind and body are cut from different cloth, is what's called the interaction problem, which is how does something immaterial? So for Descartes, immaterial meant not extended in space. He had two substances. The first one in Latin was called res extensa, which means the extended substance. That's what makes our body, makes up our bodies. And the second substance, we can go later if you'd like into why he came up with these ideas, what led him to postulate that. But the second substance, res cogitans, was the thinking substance. That's the soul substance. So it could interact with the body. But later on, people asked, well, how does that work? Descartes didn't have an answer to that. Basically said it was God. So when scientists say it's God, it means they don't have a clue how it works.
Yeah.
Incidentally, there's a very interesting piece by the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson called "A Perimeter of Ignorance," which speaks directly to that question about when scientists, even the greatest, like Newton and people like that, invoke God. It's very, very interesting. But anyway, so if you're a physicist, for example, and you're told that there's some kind of non-material entity that can causally interact with physical objects, you're going to say, well, how does it work?
Yeah.
This is a scientific claim. What's the mechanism?
It's a bit of a red flag.
Right? And how, for example, how does that happen without, say, violating the laws of conservation of energy, for example? So that's another sense in which the claim is scientific. But more generally, if you're claiming that the soul is psychologically potent and therefore is the thing that makes you a moral person or gives you consciousness, you're making claims about psychology, you're making claims about neuroscience. So those are scientific claims. If you claim, as some people do, that only human beings have souls, you're making a claim about biology. Well, we now know with a very high level of certainty that we were not planted on Earth 10,000 years ago, unlike what most people in the US, or many people in the US believe, but that we evolved from more modest life forms, and that there's a continuum, an unbroken physical continuum from very simple life forms all the way up, I mean, it's a tree of life, not all the way up, but all the way to human beings. Well, okay, at what point then did the soul get inserted into the mix? So that's, you're also making a claim about biology. So in the end then, postulating the kind of soul that we're talking about, that the book is about, amounts to making a series of claims about physics, about biology, about psychology, about neuroscience, and therefore we can evaluate the claim. We can evaluate the hypothesis. We know how to evaluate scientific hypotheses. So either they're supported by what we know or they're not. That's the idea.
Okay.
So once you start with the realization that the kind of soul that most people in the US and many around the world believe in is a scientific claim, you can then ask how can we evaluate that claim? Because we do know how to evaluate scientific hypotheses. So the first thing you look for is to see if there's actually any evidence, positive evidence, to support this notion that we have a soul. And if you go to the popular sections, you have all kinds of claims. Religious apologists, New Age gurus, and a handful of professional scientists have claimed recently, that's not just recent, in the past also, but recently especially, a number of books have come out claiming that science itself shows that there's evidence for this kind of soul. So, but the important thing that I think the public doesn't really know is that this is not what most mainstream scientists believe. This is a view on the fringes that is not representative at all of what most scientists believe. In fact, if you look at these claims and carefully, you'll realize that the evidence is not credible at all.
So an example would be the neurosurgeon
Yes.
that recently came out.
That's right. So Ibn Alexander, who was a former Harvard Medical School neurosurgeon, there was in October, I think, of 2012, the front page of Newsweek magazine had this big thing called, on the front page. It said, "Heaven is real." They announced to the world that heaven was real, and it was not a joke. It was very serious about that. And inside was a little, section on this guy. So he basically had a near-death experience and claims that his brain had completely shut down, and therefore that his experience cannot be brain-based. So I read the article. I read the book that he wrote called Proof of Heaven, which became a huge bestseller. It's just, I mean, it's very well written, it's very entertaining, but there's nothing of substance scientifically. And nobody in the sciences, virtually nobody in the sciences takes this seriously.
Okay, so now talking about that, what are some of the more mainstream scientific views about how consciousness arises from mere matter, as a lot of people would say?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I think the answer is we don't know. We just don't know. There are different views on this, but we just don't know. So one view, for example, is it's dubbed I think it's I'm forgetting his name now. Owen Flanagan, I think, famous philosopher, calls these people the Mysterians. So there's a view that says that we'll never understand consciousness. The idea is that consciousness, it's a particular aspect. It's what philosophers call qualia. And what qualia is supposed to be is the inherently subjective quality of experience, the sensation of a toothache, the redness of a rose, the smell of gasoline, right? So that's what philosophers call qualia. There's a dispute about whether qualia even make any sense, but let's say that it does, right? And so the Mysterians say we'll never understand how it works. So we're in a position, we kind of like cats with respect to quantum mechanics. Cats, so we think, will never be able to understand quantum mechanics because of cognitive limitations on them. And so, because we're animals too, we have a scope and limits, and the true theory or understanding of consciousness, according to this view, falls outside of the domain of our science formation capacity, and we'll never be able to understand it. So that's one view. I'm telling you, I'm not saying it's credible, I'm just saying that's one view.
Yeah.
Another view is, look, we don't understand it yet, but give us enough time and eventually we'll figure it out. And then there's an interesting distinction between people who think that the problem is real, it's a real problem, it has a name even, it's called the hard problem. We talked about David Chalmers coined it. But there are people who think that it's a false problem, that it's just a false problem, and it will just evaporate. There have been false problems in the past, so that's one of them. So two prominent people, if I'm not misrepresenting their views, who I think believe it's a false problem, is Daniel Dennett, who say, look, let's just do science as usual for a while longer and figure out the rest of how the mind works, what's called the easy problem. There's nothing easy about them, but compared to qualia, supposedly they're easy. And once we've figured out everything there is to figure out what else, then if there's a residue that we do not understand, then yeah, we can start revising our assumptions. But until then, it's just pointless to say there's a hard problem we don't understand. It isn't that.
So then Dennett would therefore be in support of like huge government-funded projects, like the recent one to map the brain and stuff like that, and approach it from more of a like computational neuroscience type thing.
Yes, I can't speak for him and say whether he would support the Obama initiative, for example, but certainly what he would support generally is doing science, so cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, and try to understand as much as we can about the mind and consciousness, and see where that takes us. Yeah.
And would you agree with him, or would you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the thing is we just don't know. Nobody has a crystal ball. You don't know whether suppose it's a problem that we'll never be able to solve, and we won't know that. 1,000 years from now, we'll still be around saying we don't understand consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay, it may take 100 years. It may take. We just don't know. We just don't know. I think.
What would be sorry to cut you
Yeah,
off.
go ahead.
What would be reasonable? Say we built an AI system, an artificial intelligence system that passed all the Turing tests, yada yada. Would that be evidence enough for you to say, okay, we understand consciousness because we can reproduce some of its main features?
Well, the problem with this is that the claim that people make about this aspect of consciousness is that it is inherently subjective, and so there's this notion in the literature of what's called a philosophical zombie. You may have heard about this. The idea is it's a person, so let's suppose I were to say to you, I look like a regular person. If you prick me, I'm going to say, ouch. If, I'll cry sometimes, I'll have all the outward manifestations of having feelings, emotions, an inner life, but I don't. And you can't tell. And so there's a big discussion about those zombies, whether they're possible or not, and people think it's ridiculous to even think about that. I think Dennett has a recent article with somebody else in Ticks where he claims, I haven't read it super carefully, that defined that way, the problem is simply not a scientific problem, because we can't decide unless you're in somebody's shoes, and you can't be in somebody's shoes. So, speaking to what you just said, if we could build an AI system that was indistinguishable from a real human being, at least from the outside, behave just like, or if I pull the mask and I turn out to not be human, and you say, well, you really fooled me, I thought you were human, you behaved and looked just like one. So Ray Kurzweil, the futurist, has a book about, I think, how to build a mind or something, in which he makes the interesting point that if we were to build such a system, we'd be most of us would feel compelled to ascribe consciousness to that thing. But that's the future. One thing we know for sure, and I'm sorry to preempt your question, is that some people who believe in the soul and write about it, I call them the new dualists in my book, take advantage of this ignorance that we have right now about how consciousness works to claim that, well, look, it's a well-known type of argument called it's called the God of the gaps. If you talk about God, you could call it the soul of the gaps. It's to say, look, we don't understand how consciousness works, and then they say we'll never be able to understand it as long as you are doing mere science, because it really transcends science. The soul does it. It's fallacious. They don't know that. You can't conclude from what we don't know that it must work this way or that way. But it's something that it's a class of arguments that people use to support this claim that the soul exists, and it's stuff that I review in the book. But so to get back to the main points now, so in part the book is an act of deconstruction. It's carefully showing that there's no real evidence, that all the science shows that we don't have a soul. But it's much, much more than that. It also, at the end, offers a message of hope. In a way, I'm sort of taking something away from people. Most people here believe in the soul, and they would feel like, wow, it's big. If we don't have a soul, then geez, that's kind of big, and that could be sad and terrible. But I show in the book at the end, in several chapters, that we lose nothing, I think, and I argue. We lose nothing morally, spiritually, or aesthetically by giving up our soul beliefs. In fact, we even have something to gain.
So what are some of those?
Okay, so
without spoiling
the book, maybe I should start by showing or explaining why I think we lose nothing, and then sort of from there maybe talk about why I think we gain something. So there's an analogy I have in the book, which I think is useful to try to see why we lose nothing. The analogy is to simple physical objects. Like if we take this bottle, right? If I were to hold it like this and release it from my hand, it would drop to the floor. Okay, and I could repeat the experiment many times. You could do it. Right? So, if there are such things as facts, then that's a fact about bottles or apples or what have you. Is that if you hold one in your hand and release it, unless there's a table here or it's held by a cable or something, it's going to drop to the floor, to the ground. Well, that's a fact about apples, or let's say apples for the sake of the argument. Now, if you look at history, great minds have tried to explain this fact. Why is it that objects do what they do? So Aristotle had an idea about this. He thought that objects that do that tend to their natural places. So it was a teleological sort of idea which was goal-directed, right? So he had some explanation about this.
Could you define teleological for us?
Yeah, it simply means goal-oriented, that fulfills a goal. Right?
Okay.
That's the idea. Now, in the 17th century, Isaac Newton famously came up with a different explanation. There's a goal-less force of gravity that he quantified mathematically, which is responsible for a number of things. Among them, apples falling to the ground. The explanation changed. In the early 20th century, when Albert Einstein developed his theories of relativity, the explanation changed again. So now, so the physicists tell us, gravity has to do with the curvature, or in that theory, the curvature of space-time, right? So the idea is that the facts haven't changed, right? Apples fell to the ground at the time of Aristotle, at the time of Newton, at the time of Einstein, but the explanation for why they do has changed over time. Okay, so now take this and transpose it to human beings. So what are corresponding facts about people? Well, as human beings, we are capable of experiencing a range of mental, psychological states. We can be happy, we can be sad, we can be jealous, we can be all kinds of things, right? And we have very flexible behavior, okay? So the question, and that's just a fact about people, it hasn't always been true probably because we evolved, right? But it's been true for long enough. Now, the question is, how can we explain our complex mental lives and our flexible behavior? Well, for a long, long time, the answer is we had no clue, so we said the soul does it. In fact, we even used to explain life itself by invoking what's called life souls. Aristotle did that, for example. Well, now the explanation has changed. We no longer say it's the soul that makes us behave morally or fall in love or what have you. It's what's happening in the chemistry of our brain. So we have nothing to lose in the sense that we haven't lost any of the facts. We can still fall in love, we can still appreciate beauty, we can still have language, we can still behave morally. The demise of the soul simply means that the explanation for this capacity has changed. So that's one part of the idea, right? So now back to the Apple business, right? Suppose somebody were to say, I'm terrified, I heard that say Newton was wrong, and so I'm really afraid that all my precious material possessions are going to start flying off into the sky because Newton was wrong. We'd laugh, it's silly. Likewise, if scientists say it's not the soul that makes you behave morally, who cares? You still behave morally, so that doesn't matter. Now, there's an important caveat to this, which is that there are two properties that are ascribed to the soul, which, in that case, belief in the soul suggests that we have a particular kind of free will, and also it suggests that we have immortality. Okay, so if you get rid of the soul now, that's going to have an impact on these two things. So now you have to show that that really doesn't matter, that we can live with another kind of free will, not a soul-based kind of free will, and that we don't lose anything by not being immortal, meaning that our soul doesn't survive death. And that's easy to show also. If you can show that, then you can show that there's really nothing to lose. Then we can talk about what there is to gain. So roughly the argument goes like this. There's a kind of free will that has been called in the literature contra-causal or libertarian. It's the idea that, sometimes it's also called agent causation. It's the idea that human beings are uncaused causes or prime movers, in the sense that our will causes us to do what we do. I can will to grab the bottle, to shake your hand, to talk to you, but my will itself isn't caused by anything, it's free. It's free from any kind of physical causation that we can think of. That's the view, that's libertarian or contra-causal free will. Now if you ask what's the mechanism that can give us that, well, the answer is it's the soul. Because the soul, in Descartes' system, is itself in a different plane of reality, isn't subject to the laws of cause and effect, but it itself has causal powers. Right? In Descartes' system, the soul can interacts with the body. We talked about this earlier in the pineal gland in the brain, and makes us do what we do. So the soul is the uncaused cause, and it's what's supposed to give us libertarian free will. So I'm not going to go over all the details, but basically it's pretty easy to show that this kind of free will, if you think about it, doesn't make any sense actually, and that we wouldn't want to have it anyway. So losing that doesn't mean that we lose our free will or autonomy at all. It doesn't mean that we lose any meaningful notion of moral responsibility. That's rather easy to show. So in sum, if we don't have a soul-based kind of free will, we've really lost nothing. In fact, we've probably gained something, so that's good. Then there's the question of immortality. So the soul narrative is one way to resolve what's been called the mortality paradox. So there's a great book, since I know you like popular science, by a philosopher called Stephen Cave, and the book is called Immortality, and there's a subtitle I don't really remember. And in that book, he looks at various scenarios for immortality that we've sort of concocted over history, over time. One of them, of course, is the soul narrative. So he has this notion of what's called the mortality paradox, which goes something like this. The first leg of the paradox is that we are a species whose members have become aware of their own mortality because of our cognitive capacity. We know we're going to die. I know I'm going to die. I don't think about it every day, but I know I'm going to die. You know you're going to die, right? That's just a fact of life, and we're aware of it. That's one part of the paradox. The other part of the paradox, according to him, what's kind of interesting, is that our consciousness is such that it cannot simulate its non-existence. You can't consciously simulate what it's like to not be conscious. Mm-hmm. And so that's really just frightening.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we know we're going to die, and on the other hand, it's unimaginable that our consciousness will not be here anymore. So the way the soul narrative resolves the paradox is by saying, yeah, okay, your body's going to die, but your consciousness, which is your soul, never dies. It's never extinguished. You don't have to worry about what is it like to not be conscious, because you'll never not be conscious. Okay, so now, how bad would it be to just learn that we're in fact mortal? Well, the answer is, for people in the US who all believe in immortality, if overnight you force them to conclude that they're not, it might not be very good. But in general, it's quite possible for people to be perfectly okay about this. If you look, for example, at what's happening in countries in which levels of beliefs in the soul or God or religion are very, very low, like the Scandinavian countries, people don't fret over that. They're very happy. There are studies on this, actually. Their societies function very well. And so the point that the book makes is that there are other ways to deal with the mortality paradox. The soul narrative is not the only way. And so if there are other ways, then we're fine. We don't lose anything if we lose the soul narrative.
So a lot of, on that note, poets and novelists and artists will say that the finitude of life is actually what gives it beauty and stuff like that. So that would be one way to rationalize it, because that's what it kind of sounds like, is that the brain, or we find ways to rationalize our own existence, meaning in the world, stuff like that, and the soul isn't necessarily needed there.
That's right.
You would agree?
Absolutely, yeah. That's, in fact, it's part of what is called, again, Stephen Cave in this book calls this the wisdom narrative. It's built on a few ideas, and in fact, I think it flows very nicely from the materialistic view of personhood that is really reviled in the U.S. I should say that there's a cultural national narrative that is constantly repeated in the U.S. Because we're an overtly religious society. We've talked about this. Given how wealthy the country is, we're extremely religious. We're off the charts if you compare to other countries. So the soul narrative has two parts. The first part is that, yes, we have a soul. And you hear this repeated all the time in our culture, in our movies, in popular books, on the radio. Politicians talk about it. Clergymen talk about it. The other half of the claim is that without belief in the soul and personal immortality, life would suck. We'd be miserable. Our society would kind of fall apart. So again, that too is a claim you can test. Well, how do you test it? Well, you go look to see, look at societies where people tend to not believe that. See if they are falling apart. They're not.
So
they're doing quite well.
Actually, on that note, I have
Yes.
some statistics here.
Sure.
So I'm just going to read off.
Sure.
According to a recent Harris poll, the number of Americans who believe in the survival of the soul after death has decreased from 69% to 64% over the last 5 years, while the belief in Darwinian evolution has gone up over the last 5 years from 42 to 47. So do you think this is a coincidence, or do you, so basically, I guess more fundamentally I'm asking is, actually no, let's just ask that. Do you think it's a coincidence?
Well, those are interesting numbers. So take the first two, that something over 60% of the population believes in the survival of the soul. So that goes to show that's the common narrative here. And I don't know if a 4% or 5% decrease is meaningful in that case, but we have there is data available, not from Harris, but from I think Gallup, that go back to the middle of the 20th century, where you see that what's really interesting is you see that, so it compares the US and other first world countries, Western Europe, for example, other places. You find that around, I think, 1947, when they started doing the surveys, the numbers were kind of like that for everyone. So, France, Germany, all these countries, and the US. As time went by, the number in the US didn't budge. It kind of went up a little bit, went down, but remained like that. Whereas there was a massive wave of secularization in other countries, first world countries, and the numbers really dropped. And now in France, it's about 30-40%. In maybe a little more in Scandinavia, it's really low. So that's the first set of numbers. The second set of numbers is also very interesting. In fact, it's probably exaggerated, because if you ask, there are also polls on. So as somebody who's looking at the US from the outside, what's happening with evolution is remarkable. The level of denial is, again, unprecedented in the industrial world, okay? Which many people argue is linked to the level of religiosity, because religion overtly fights the implications of Darwin's theory, especially when it comes to human evolution. These numbers that you cited, that 40% of the population believes in evolution, they're kind of tricky, because you have to ask whether, so evolution means animal evolution and also human evolution. They may believe in animal evolution, but they're very, very cautious, and when you ask about human evolution, the numbers drop. And the number of people, I think, who believe in, so there are people among those who believe in evolution, but crucially, they believe that it was guided by the hand of God. If you now ask how many Americans believe in evolution the way, say, scientists do, without any involvement from God, which scientists don't think that God, sort of has anything to do with evolution, the numbers drop dramatically. So now the relationship between the two, it's really hard to tell whether there's a relationship in this particular case, but there should be one. And here's why. There should be one, because if you adopt the conclusions of evolutionary biology and the story about our origins, you close the door for the soul. So here's how this works. Until Darwin came up with his ideas in the middle of the 19th century, people believed that, and many people still do in the US, that human beings were created in the image of God, pretty much in present form, and separately from the rest of the animals. So on that scenario, it makes sense that God creates us and gives us a soul, but not to the other animals, okay? Because we're separate and we're in the, we look like we're in the image of God. The moment you realize that there's no discontinuity, which is what evolution teaches you, that all life is sort of continuous, has a single origin, then it poses the following problem for the soul. Okay, if you can trace a continuous path between very simple life forms, roughly 3.5 billion years ago, through the tree of life to human beings, if there's an unbroken physical chain between these 2 points, then at what point do you insert any kind of non-physical ingredient. So if you think through the implications of Darwinian theory, it provides powerful arguments against this notion of an immaterial soul. So in principle, the two numbers should be connected.
Yeah.
Although I don't know if people engage in this kind of reasoning and sort of connect the dots. But that's really interesting.
Okay. And related to that question, then I guess, and we talked about this earlier, but I want the viewers to hear about it too. In terms of soul beliefs and beliefs about free will and stuff like that, what's the point in getting people to change it? Do they have any, does their changing their views have any real world implications about their view of justice, for instance, about their economic, political beliefs, things that are outside the realm of personal, religious?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So I believe it does, and there's an argument that has been made that's very interesting. So there's a paper that came out maybe a decade ago, I think, by Joshua Green, a very good cognitive neuroscientist at Harvard, and I think Jonathan Cohen, I think, was his mentor. The paper is called For the Law, you'll see how it relates to your question. It's called For the Law, Neuroscience Changes Everything and Nothing. And they're probably not the first people to make this point. But the point is precisely what you said, that our intuitive dualism, meaning the fact that we view intuitively mind and body as sort of two separate things, not being cut from the same cloth, and that we have a contra-causal or libertarian notion of free will, has an impact on how we view justice and punishment. So the argument runs something like this. If you look historically at the reasons why we punish people, there's roughly two reasons. One is forward-looking, and it's called consequentialist. So you punish people who behave criminally because you want, down the road, first of all, you want to contain those individuals, obviously. If there's a rapist around, you don't want them to continue raping, you want to contain them so that you avoid future bad consequences. But you also want to send a message. You want there to be some kind of deterrent that says, look, if you behave that way, then you're going to pay the price. This is anchored in classical utilitarianism, so it's called a consequentialist. It's looking forward. It doesn't really care about what view of free will is correct. It only cares about people being rational, or rational enough at the time that they perform the deeds to be punishable. But that's one view. The other view is based on retribution. It's called retributivism. And the idea is that if you're a consequentialist, you're really missing the point. The reason we punish people is because they deserve it. And so they deserve to suffer. And the reason they deserve to suffer is that they could have done otherwise. So they were placed in a situation and they acted one way. But if you had placed them in exactly the same situation at exactly the same time, they could have chosen to do otherwise. And so they're bad people, and so we punish them, and so we make them suffer. It turns out that this view, which is sort of backward looking, you're now looking back at the origins of the action and say, well, you could have done otherwise, we're going to punish you. This view hinges on a very narrow resolution of the free will problem. You have to believe in some kind of contra-causal view of free will for this view to hold. So does the argument run. The minute you show that contra-causal free will is scientifically a non-starter, then the view kind of falls apart. And so now you're saying you're making people suffer for no good reason. And so yes, so that's one area in which people have claimed that it matters what beliefs we have, and it matters that our dualistic beliefs, because they pervert, if you will, our conception of responsibility and our conception of human beings, pervert in the sense that they're just not realistic. It's not what really happens. Then they can lead to suffering. Now, this is especially important in a country like the US, where we have a completely dysfunctional criminal justice system. We have the highest incarceration, one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. It's something like 750 inmates per 100,000 inhabitants. It's out of bounds with the rest of the world. It's not linked to crime patterns. Our system is completely biased towards the poor, minorities, completely unfair, and we are also the only country, the only first world country that still imposes a death penalty on its people. So having a sense of justice in here, especially based on this notion of retribution, that leads to problems, certainly. Just to give you an anecdote, during the run-up to the, I think it was 2012 campaign, presidential campaign, Rick Perry, you remember, was one of the candidates, and he was the former governor of Texas. During one of the debates, it was Brian Williams, I think from NBC, was moderating, and asked Perry, he said, well, as governor of Texas, you've overlooked the execution of, I think the number is 234 people. Have you ever had trouble sleeping at night thinking that some of these people might have been innocent? Perry, you can watch this on YouTube, it's very interesting. Perry's answer is no, because in Texas we have a very thoughtful process, et cetera, so I'm perfectly fine with it. Now, something really interesting happened when Williams mentioned the fact that over 200 people have been executed. The crowd cheered, erupted in cheers. I don't remember where the debate took place. So Williams was sort of taken aback by that, and he asked Rick Perry, he said, well, Governor Perry, why do you think that the mention of the execution of more than 200 people drew applause from the crowd? And Perry's response was, well, Brian, I think that Americans understand justice. So there you have the link, right? They understand justice, so they know that it's good to kill people because they deserve it. So the link is there, obviously, and it's so very interesting. So that's one area in which our dualistic intuitions might actually be counterproductive. And if you look at polls, you'll find that the majority of people in the US are in favor of the death penalty. And when even though most of them know that it's not a deterrent to crime, and it has led to the death of innocent people, so that doesn't seem to bother them. And when they're asked why they're in favor of the death penalty, they very often invoke the Bible, the biblical injunction that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Well, that's one area in which our dualistic beliefs can have some pretty bad consequences. There's in fact an article by the psychologist Paul Bloom. I don't remember where it was published. It was a popular article called "Worse Than Creationism," in which he makes the kind of argument, doesn't really talk about justice, but makes the argument that because dualism is not scientifically credible, it sort of alters the way we understand ourselves and each other, and it leads to bad policy decisions, bad decisions altogether. Other areas involve, say, what I call in the book the edges of life, so the beginning of life, and the endlessly polarizing debate over abortion. If you look at the surveys, and public opinion in the US is very carefully monitored, so we know what people think. You find that the best predictor of whether or not you're going to oppose abortion is not your age or gender, it's the strength of your religious beliefs. Okay, not too surprisingly. And so then you turn to religion, you say, why would religion be against abortion? Well, it has to do with the soul, it turns out. We can run through the argument, but and it's sad that in the 21st century we have to have discussions where abortion, in fact, when then candidate Barack Obama and Joe Biden were running for election for the campaign for the presidency, their politicians are inevitably asked about their view on abortion. Amazingly, both of them pitched it in terms of theological terms. So Obama said something like, well, those theological questions are like above my pay grade. Okay, no, it's theological questions, not scientific, but it's theological questions. Biden said something that, there was a newspaper article, I think he said that as a matter of faith, he was willing to believe that, life begins at the moment of conception, something like that, I remember. But the point is that the debate was automatically couched in religious terms. That's just tragic, that these notions of ensoulment, as it's called, like at what point does the soul enter the body, in the 21st century should have anything to do with a debate about abortion. So
kind of like how many angels fit upon the head of a needle.
Pretty much. In fact, the argument from the Catholic Church is very clever and sort of maddening. So you can read it all over the internet. So people talk to their congregations, and people hear about this stuff all the time. The argument runs like this. First, so this was written by the guy who wrote this, I cite in the book, is a theologian with, I think, a PhD in neuroscience. I'm not kidding. Who was educated at Harvard. It's just like crazy, right? So the point he makes, he says, look, the church has never really settled the ensoulment question, meaning there's been a debate going hundreds of years as to whether ensoulment, so the moment at which the soul enters the body, is immediate, meaning at the moment of conception, or delayed, a little bit later. And depending on who you read, Aristotle, somebody else, you might have a different idea on this. Now, he said, but it really doesn't matter that we haven't settled the debate, because we have to act as though ensoulment was immediate. And here's why, he says. If ensoulment is, suppose ensoulment is delayed, and you abort a little packet of cells that hasn't yet had a soul, right? Then the problem, he says, is that, well, sorry, let me take this back. Suppose ensoulment is immediate. So you have the soul right away, you kill a little packet of cell, terrible, the soul's already there, you kill a person, that's horrible, that's murder. But suppose that ensoulment happens later, and you kill a little packet of cells. And the problem, he says, with that is that you actually deprive that little packet of cells from the opportunity of having a soul, and therefore being reunited with God in the afterlife and experiencing bliss in heaven. That's worse than murder. So either way, you can't have it. So you have to act, you can't have abortion. So you have to act as though ensoulment is immediate.
And when was this argument made?
Oh, this was recently. This is not the first time I think it's made. But so basically it's invoking the soul to argue that we should not have abortion. As you said, it's in the 21st century. So if there was a good case that you can imagine what my position is on abortion, given that I'm an academic and grew up in France, but regardless of my position, if somebody could present a good argument against it, rational argument with evidence, that's fine to listen. But when they invoke something like the soul, it's in the 21st century, it's just a scandal, and that's unfortunately what happens.
But clearly then, like your earlier claim that the soul is falls under the domain of scientific inquiry does not hold true for people working in the Vatican or people like that. They don't agree with you. Even scientists don't agree with you. Because I know another. I think the Vatican's astronomer. I might be wrong, but they have an astronomer who was trained at like Harvard or Caltech or MIT or one of those, and is like a real physicist. So clearly, science and religion in that end, people can rationalize it to some way where they can work in science over here, and then they can work in religion over here, like the neuroscience.
Right. I think, but in this case, what we discussed earlier remains valid. The soul that most people believe in. So there's often a difference between what we called ethnoscience earlier, what people believe, and then what clever theologians can come up with. Yeah, I'm sure they can find all kinds of ways to render all the claims unfalsifiable and make it purely metaphysical and therefore divorced from reality. Well, then they have nothing to say if that's the case. It doesn't apply to the real world, so they should have nothing to say. But for all the reasons I mentioned, the kind of soul that people believe in, that is a scientific hypothesis. So theologians might say, oh, it's not what I believe in. But I'd say, I don't care what you believe in. Most people aren't theologians. I care about what most people believe. It's really written for everyone who's ever thought about or has an interest in the question of the soul. So for those who believe in the soul, then they ought to read this book. If they're curious at all, just to see, well, it may change their minds. It's happened in the past. I've seen people change their minds on questions like that. But even if they don't change their minds, it will at least shed I think, a truer and kinder light on those of us who do not happen to share their beliefs and are so often vilified in our pro-religious culture. So people who believe in the soul should definitely read that book. It's also a very friendly book. It's not written in an abrasive, arrogant way. I've paid very careful attention to tone, actually, for those reasons.
Which is something a lot of other popularizers of science
haven't perhaps done. Yes, that's right. I mean, tactically they may have been correct. So tactically, initially, you might want to be abrasive and arrogant, just tactically to call attention to an issue. And then when you follow through, then you want to be, kind. And I think that's what I want to be. I want to be kind and respectable. I don't want to diss people and say, look, this is ridiculous. But really just say, look, you believe in this, you're a person like me, we have different ideas, let's just talk about this. Now, so that's people who believe in the soul. People who do not believe in the soul, and it's a growing group actually, I think would love the book because it would be grist for their mill. And they would find that their skepticism, I would show them step by step, is warranted and practical. And then if people are simply curious and they don't really know, where they stand, then they should read the book because hopefully that will help push them on one side of the fence or the other. So it's really meant it's written in language that is not technical, it's accessible, it does not presuppose any kind of scientific background, and it's written with a very, very large audience in mind.
Awesome. Well, on that note, Julien, thank you for letting me interview you, and see you guys later. Oh, the book comes out, the book comes out
on January 6th, 2015.
And you could pre-order it on Amazon.
And you can pre-order it on Amazon, yes.
Beautiful.